This demo will be in JavaScript with a backend in Python, but bear in mind we support all the major languages and frameworks, as well as mobile and native. Once you create a project to represent your app in Sentry, it'll give you a key called a data source name or a DSN key. This is something you put in your source code where you initialize the Sentry SDK so it knows where to send the errors to, which is your account at Sentry.io. That being said, let's take a look at what this allows us to do with this web app built in React called the Tool Store. In the Tool Store here, we're going to generate an error when we purchase the items in our shopping cart. So let's start that process. We get an error, and when this happens, the user calls support, and together they're limited in their ability to debug this because they don't know where in the code the error happened. Fortunately, the developers were already notified about this via Slack, among other email and integrations that we support. This is the first problem that Sentry helps you solve in your debugging workflow, and that's getting alerted about the problems in your code. So we click the link to open this in Sentry.io, and now we've got it in the hands of the right people. There's a lot of info to help us here, so let's break this down by section, starting with the header, where we get the error type and message, followed by a quick glimpse at the impact and number of unique users affected. This event happened 406 times, and we can refer to all of these collectively as the issue in Sentry. So that's why you sometimes hear this referred to as the issue page. We can say that this is an open issue in Sentry that we're dealing with right now. An event is an instance of an issue. The stack trace shows the line of code that all of these events errored on. It's the most important thing that our grouping algorithm uses to group these into the issue. More on grouping when we get to the aggregations portion of this. Tags are diagnostic information set by the SDK regarding the individual event. So notice their values may change if you scroll between each individual event. The breadcrumbs are a history and timeline of things leading up to the error. They include things like HTTP requests, log statements from the console or server, and DOM events in JavaScript. You can set your own breadcrumbs and tags so this event is more useful for debugging. We'll talk about that when we get to the adding context section. The facet map here shows the distribution of values for the tags across all the events that make up this issue. Metadata about the host that produced this error is down here. And finally, your SDK name and version number. So now let's take a look at what actions we can take for the resolution of this problem. If this issue was auto-assigned to you already, consider reassigning it to one of the suggested assignees, who are developers who updated the code behind the stack trace recently. Sentry knows this because it's based on something called the suspect commits. Suspect commits leverage Sentry's integrations with your source code management tools like GitHub, Bitbucket, and GitLab. Suspect commits are commits from your repository that updated one or more files in the stack trace. So if we look at our stack trace here, we see app.js. So those suspect commits updated app.js or some other file in the stack trace here. You could also open up a Jira issue. We integrate with other popular issue tracking softwares as well. Once someone deploys the fix to your app, then you can click Resolve for this issue, so it's no longer open or marked as unresolved in your issue stream here. It would also be considered resolved for the current release that this issue happened in. More on releases in the upcoming sections. If you're still working on the fix, but you don't want the alert to keep coming in, then click Ignore to snooze that alert. We'll show you some options later for how you can filter this event out from coming in a 407th time. We have an entire section devoted to filtering. Now, let's recap what we've accomplished so far. We installed the SDK in our app. When the error happens, the SDK captures it along with other contextual information and sends it as something called an event to Sentry.io. From there, based on any rules and configurations, someone will get alerted about it. Then on Sentry.io, you can begin triaging it. For the resolution, we use suspect commits to get it in the hands of the developer who wrote the code that is erroring. We also open a Jira ticket, and once they committed the new code to fix this and redeploy, we mark the issue as resolved and called it a day. Now that we've got the basics down, Let's learn more about the overall flow of your events as they go through Sentry and see what we can use to our advantage so that everything coming in is actionable and anything not useful is getting filtered out.
This is the relation between your apps and Sentry.io, which has a lot going on to process your events. But there's only 4 things that you should focus on because they affect whether an event is accepted or not, and ultimately how your quota is utilized. And you can adjust each of these yourself. Filtering and data scrubbing can be performed from within the SDK in your app as well, so let's start there. We saw earlier how to initialize Sentry. We have some additional options we can pass here for filtering and data scrubbing. For instance, there's a callback function called before send that you can pass to this initialization constructor. And you can do this for any of our SDKs. The function is invoked when the exception is thrown and includes the event object that Sentry puts together for you, which includes the exception. You can inspect it, and then based on anything you like or dislike about it, you can return null and the event will be discarded. It will not be sent onward to Sentry.io. Or you can transform the data you see on it, and this can serve as a form of data scrubbing, in which case you would still return the event so it gets sent to Sentry.io. And you can do the same for breadcrumbs, which does the same thing conceptually. Just return null if you want to ignore the breadcrumb, or you can transform something on that breadcrumb and then return it so it still gets recorded. Let's see what other options we have. There's a whole list of configuration options, and we recommend you review it at some point, but let's look at blacklist and whitelist URLs for now. With these, the SDK can discard the events for you based on the URL from which the error was thrown. This is good for ignoring errors thrown by third-party JavaScript libraries that were downloaded into your app. Just put the URL of where that library was loaded from. Another technique you can use involves your loggers in your application. Configure your loggers to send to Sentry or not based on the log level of that error. Be sure to check if Sentry already offers integration for your logger, like we do with Java and Python, among a few others. If there's no Sentry integration, then go to the configuration for your logger and instrument Sentry there. So if there is a Sentry integration, then this invocation of your logger will send this to Sentry. And if we don't have an integration, then just go to where you initialize your logger, and there should be some kind of config or middleware so that you can instrument Sentry. What you would instrument is this method here, sentry.captureException. So then in every catch block, for instance, that your logger is used, this Sentry method will get called as well. Now that we've seen how to filter and data scrub from within the application, let's move on to the server side and see the first thing that acts upon your events as they hit the server, and that's rate limiting. So open up your project settings and click on Client Keys DSN. Then click Configure for your key. A rate limit is a way to cap the amount of events accepted during a time window. So here, I'm accepting at most 5,000 within an hour. Anything beyond that will get dropped. You can generate a DSN key for each test, staging, or prod environment, and then control the rate limit separately for each of those. And you can also disable a key at any point in time and then enable it later. If you're wondering for how to set your rate limit, then we recommend setting up Sentry for your app and see what your event volume is over a 7 or 14-day period without a rate limit. If the rate limiting is happening, you could always come back here and you'll see what events were accepted, and anything that was rate limited will be in red and will say rate limited here. So let's take a larger view of our data, let's say past 30 days. Then find your highest spike in volume in this time period. So if I click and zoom in here on this spike, and then I want to set my rate limit whatever the peak of this spike is, for how many events happened within this time range. So I would go back to the DSN configuration and then set my rate limit based on what I'm seeing here. If you set your rate limit too low, then you run the risk of not being able to tell when your app is actually having a problem, as you'd have more of a flat graph curve here. You'd be dropping events and you wouldn't know how many users are being impacted. And when your users are being impacted, you want to be able to see what those events were and not be dropping them. So that wraps up rate limiting. So now let's take a look at filtering and data scrubbing from the server side, since we've already seen it on the application SDK side. So go to your project settings where you have a dedicated section called inbound filters. There are some easy ones you can turn on here, but let's look at custom filters. You can filter by release, which is a version of your code, and we'll talk more about releases in the next section. If you had a buggy release that's been fixed, but customers are still accessing that version of your app, then you can ignore its errors here by putting the release number. You can also filter by error message. In this example here, I put the error type followed by the error's message. And this supports the wildcard character, so you only have to put part of the error message. And if that event keeps coming in and the message is slightly different, then as long as it matches here, it'll get filtered out. So let's take a look at the issue in Sentry that I took this example from. So this issue here happened 2 times. This was the error type, and this was the error message. And I'm just making the match on this part of the message, and then I put a wildcard, so it doesn't matter what the text is after here, it will get selected by the filter. This is useful because sometimes the only difference in your error message is an ID or URI or a piece of SQL syntax, and if it's different every time, then that'll create multiple different issues in your dashboard. So let's compare this inbound filter on error message to another feature we have called delete and discard. Delete and discard also sets a filter for you, but it's based on a full match of this error message, so it's not going to apply to as many use cases in the future. Whether you use the error message filter in inbound filters or delete and discard, this event will not happen a third time. It'll hit our ingestion layer and we will drop it. It will not get persisted and stored, nor count towards your quota. So now, let's talk about data scrubbing. We have a dedicated section in our docs on security and privacy. And you can also find this at the project level. Right now, we're at the organization setting level. So you can turn on regular data scrubbing here. And if you have additional sensitive fields, then you can list them here. So this brings up the question, what are the default fields getting scrubbed? Well, they're listed in our documentation here. So if there's anything additional, you can put that in this field. You can mark fields as safe as well if they're getting scrubbed by accident. And we have another feature called advanced data scrubbing. If you don't see this section here, then go into your general settings and click the button for Enable Early Adopter Features. So with advanced data scrubbing, you choose what is the field that you want to scrub out, and then what do you want to do with the value for that field? Do you want it to be replaced with a hash, or masked with stars, or removed altogether? And another useful option in here is custom regex. So let's say you have a field coming in on one of your events, and it's something like patient name. Well, then you can put a regex here that covers many different ways that the phrase patient name might be written, whether it's patient dash name, patient underscore name, capital N, lowercase n, and so forth.
Now let's see how aggregation works and how we can use this to clean up what we're looking at in our dashboards and have a more manageable issue stream. I'll give an example of how to customize aggregation from the SDK side, and then we'll look at how to do it through some settings on Sentry.io. Let's review first how aggregation works. So these events that happened 2.5 thousand times got grouped together into the same issue. So let's think about why that happened. Well, it's because each of these events shared the same fingerprint, which is something that Sentry uses to uniquely identify the events and group them together into the issue. Sentry uses a combination of the stack trace, the error type, and the error message to set this fingerprint. So let's take a look at how we can alter this fingerprint from the SDK side and then see that from the server side. So one way you can do it in the SDK, if you recall that before send callback that we worked with earlier where you initialize the SDK, you can update the fingerprint on certain events of your choosing. So maybe you have some events coming in and they're causing 10 different issues and you'd rather have all those issues get grouped together into the same single issue. Well, look at anything on that event and try to decide that they're the item of interest here. So for instance, maybe they're all for a database connection error. So if you can identify that using the event or this hint object, which Sentry provides, it has additional context and info about the exception, then set the fingerprint as database connection error. Therefore, all the events that were an instance of this database connection error will have the same fingerprint, and you'll have one issue instead of those 10 issues. So you could identify this based on maybe something in a tag or a stack trace or anything at all in the event. Another way you can do it, Rather than use before send, you can go into your app source code. For instance, here we're setting the fingerprint not on the stack trace. We're not letting it be that by default. We're saying that whenever there's an HTTP request, that if there's an error, then we want to set the fingerprint based on whatever the method on that HTTP request was, as well as the path and the error status code. So then rather than having multiple different issues, you can now merge some of those together by setting the same fingerprint for them based on the method, path, and error status code. So you can really use anything for your own judgment here. So now let's look at how to do this through Sentry.io and some settings that we have. So we have a guide on it here and some info you can review again about what the fingerprint is. Let's take a look at how to do merging for issues that have already come in, whose events have already been accepted. And then we'll look at how to set rules for incoming events in the future. So for one, if you have lots of issues and they only vary slightly by something like the message here, check them off and click merge. Also, you can open up a single issue and Sentry will give you suggestions for issues that are very similar and why. And then you can check them off and hit merge as well. And finally, let's look at server-side fingerprinting. So in this case, you might have some issues coming in that are the same error type, and the message is the same for each, except for something like a URL name, the host name. So in this case, you can set a rule where we're saying this was the error message. It starts with safe HTTP connection pool, and the host equals star. So now any issue that has this message in it, that starts off with this text string here, these will get grouped together because they all get the same fingerprint set for them, which is connection timeout type. And if you look at our documentation, you can see that you can group by more than just the message. You can do on type, message, value, function, and path of the file.
Let's talk configuration. A project is a representation of your app in Sentry, which your app's events will be sent to. I'll give some tips on this now, but you can find this info later here in our guide. The general rule for what to create a project for is your Sentry projects should be in a 1-to-1 ratio with your apps, with the definition of an app here being a repository of code. So if I have a code base for this React app, then make it a project. This Sentry project gives me a DSN key, which I put in my code base where I initialize the Sentry SDK, so that only errors from that app come to this project. If I have a second React app that has its own code base and build process, then make that a different project. This applies to microservices as well. If you have multiple backend microservices, then create a project for each of those microservices. Now for monolithic architectures, a few things. If your monolith has multiple code bases, then create a project for each of those code bases and initialize the SDK in each of those. If your monolith is one code base, but runs discretely in different ways, for instance, one instance of it powers an API and another instance of it powers web pages, then create a project for each of those instances. If your monolith is one code base and one project, then if you're concerned about the alerts coming into too many developers and teams at once, then we'll show you in the next section how to leverage alerts and issue owners to make sure that alerts get routed based on where in your code base the errors are happening, so you get them in the hands of the right people responsible for those areas of the code. You can also view a list of the projects and create them by going through the organization settings here. This brings us to our next entity in configuration, which is teams. The projects whose events you can see are governed per team in Sentry. One team can have multiple projects. And by being a member on that team, you now have access to that team's projects. So these members for this team here have access to these projects here. And projects can be shared across multiple teams. Here are all the teams that I'm on, therefore I get access to the projects of each of these teams. The next entity we're going to cover is releases. A release in Sentry represents a version of your code that is deployed. You can see how many new issues you're having per release. You can make as few or as many releases as you want, whether that's per day, week, or month, or for every version of your code. When we get to the section on Discover, we'll look at an enhanced report where you can see error counts across your releases along with any associated metadata. To take full advantage of this, you need to set the release number when initializing your SDK. So let's take a look at that. Use the release property here and put the version of your code here. You'll also want to set the release using our Sentry CLI tool during your build process. This allows you to take advantage of our suspect commits feature and source code versioning integration we saw earlier. You run these commands, and this allows you to see the commits and files change per release as well, which we'll see in a second. We have additional information on releases here on this page for our CLI tool. So let's take a look at a release that got made. You can see what issues are new for this release versus those that were marked as resolved. You can see what files were changed for this release, what were the commits, and then who were the specific authors behind these commits. If you're viewing an individual issue, you can also see in which release the issue first happened, as well as what is the latest release it's happened in. And the facet map down here will show you what percentage of releases this issue is happening in. Our next entity for configuration is environments. Don't forget to specify the environment when initializing your Sentry SDK. This way your events are associated to the environment in which they occurred. And you can view your events by environment using this top-level filter here, and we'll see this kind of filter in many other places in the Sentry, like Discover as well as in our alerts. Do not make the mistake of creating a separate project for each of your environments. A project should only be listed once here for the one app that it represents. The last entity is deployments. Deployments are good if you have releases for multiple projects and you want to see that they are deployed together. In that case, you want to set the deployments tag for those releases. It's also good for customers who trigger builds in every commit, which makes a release for every commit, but not all of those builds are getting deployed to production. So in that case, you can use the deployments feature to track when it does go to production. And here's the information on creating deploys. You can use this command here.
In this section on workflow and integrations, we're going to cover how Sentry can enhance your overall debugging experience.
Because while the success here is the end state we want to get to, you'll need more than just your existing CI/CD process of getting new code into production. You've already got that down. You need to get alerted about problems in your code, triage them effectively, and finally be able to manage this process as a whole. Basically, Sentry wants you to see debugging as a workflow or a process in and of itself that's collaborative and just as important as your current CI/CD pipeline. And Sentry's integrations will help you accomplish this. With this in place, you can reach this end state as fast as possible, which will free up your developers' time tremendously. And once you've got this down, you won't be able to live without it. So let's see what features and integrations Sentry has to offer for this. In the integrations dashboard and your organization settings, the list is quite extensive. We don't need to go through these one by one, but it's more helpful to see how they fit into your team debugging process that we're trying to help you establish. So let's review that. Our integrations for notifications and incidents will help you solve the problem of getting alerted about problems of your code and getting them into the hands of the right people. Your project management integrations are really good for keeping track of what those problems are once you've identified and triaged them. Data visualization tools are great for understanding trends in your problems, but we'll see soon how you can use Sentry's Discover tool to do much of the same. Finally, source code management integration helps you with both triage and resolution because it'll allow you to see the commits that correspond to the error in code as well as the authors behind them, and finally roll out new releases which have commits issuing the fix. And you can track this amongst your deployments. We recommend setting up a learning and source management integrations first if you haven't set up any of these yet, so let's take a look at those. You can configure alerts in your project settings. You can trigger an alert based on any of these criteria, like an issue in general, as we saw in the demo I presented, or you can do issue state changes. So if something gets marked resolved in one release, then you have a new release the next day, and it happens again, you can get alerted that a regression has occurred. You can also alert based on tags, which could be anything from the URL in your app that the error happened to the server name, the file, or module that caused it as well. And these tags are set by default depending on the SDK, but you can set your own tags as well. And bear in mind that the more specific you can be in what you're looking for, then the more specific that the person or team you're looking to alert can be notified about, as opposed to alerting the entire engineering department at once. So here are actions for what to do if we meet the condition. So you can send via Slack, PagerDuty, email. If you were to choose Slack, choose a workspace and then a specific channel that you want to notify them. And Sentry also has an internal integration platform, and this allows you to use anything as an integration, even if Sentry doesn't support it out of the box. So if you select this option here, then you'll see any of your internal integrations listed here. And I'll show you in a few minutes how to set those up. So next is issue owners. And this is an issue management feature within Sentry as opposed to something like Jira. So let's talk about how I used it with this React app. Let's say that 90% of my code base in here is in this components directory, and 10% of my code base is in critical here. And that's for critical things like logins, registrations, or where customers are using their credit cards on my website. Well, I'll define an issue owner rule here that says if an error comes from any file in the critical directory, then assign this to a team of people called heroes in Sentry. Otherwise, I have a fallback condition here that says everything else that doesn't meet this condition will get assigned to team everyone else. Next, let's look at the Sentry integration platform. This is in your org settings. Put the name of what your external integration is and the URL of it as well. Then there's two main things you can do. You can have the alert go to this URL here so that you could then go configure an alert and select this My Service as an option in that dropdown like we saw in alerts. And you would have to check off this box to make it available in that dropdown. Or instead of getting an alert sent to myservice.com, you could have the event itself get sent as opposed to the alert. So then uncheck this and come down here, select read write, and say you want the error to get sent, or you want the issue information in general to get sent. In this section, we'll look at how to provide additional context to your events, and this will be a good lesson on how the event helps you understand the exception in context of its execution or runtime environment. And this is what really sets Sentry apart from just seeing the error alone in a log file. It enhances your ability to reason about your program and debug better. When you see it in Sentry.io, it will be that much more actionable, especially if you add your own customization. So let's start with tags. These are all reportable in Discover, even the custom tags that we're going to set. So let's take a look at an event in Python and the tags there. So this happened 30,000 times, which means it was the same stack trace in all those, but the values of the tags may have been different. For instance, what was the host or container that was running this Python program? What was the release of my code that this event happened in? Or maybe what was the URL defined in my router that this happened in? Let's see how to set a tag. You can call the setTag method, and you can do this from anywhere in your code as long as the SDK has been initialized. The scope object just represents your context, and it holds useful info that gets sent along with the event. The SDK is intelligent enough to start building the scope right when the SDK is initialized, and it builds info based on your routes, controllers, and the host and other things. So what are some good examples for custom tags? Custom tags are great for things that Sentry cannot be aware of. For instance, something about, say, your business logic or who your customers are. And that's something we used in our JavaScript event earlier. We set our own custom tag called customer type, because this is not something whose value is hard-coded, it's loaded dynamically. Another example for something you could use a custom tag for is a feature flag, which could indicate that the customer's user experience has some feature enabled or not. You could also use them in general for anything mission critical that's going on. The URL tag here can reveal what code is involved on this web page where the error was thrown, as well as the release. If you click on releases here, then you could figure out what were all the commits and files that were updated. The stack trace obviously reveals the line of code and file that the error was thrown in. And while this isn't a custom tag, which is reportable in Discover, the file name is still reportable in Discover. So we'll see in the next section a report on error counts by file names. So another cool feature with tags is setting a transaction ID. And this is something for a design pattern you can use called tracing. It's basically a technique in Sentry you can use. So I set a transaction ID on this JavaScript event when I go to make an HTTP request to my backend server. And then in the backend event, in the Python code, we actually absorb that tag out of the headers, we parse it, and then we set it as a tag in the backend. So the benefit of doing this is that you can now see all of your events that share a transaction ID. So you can trace it from front end to back end and other microservices that get associated as well. So we have documentation on this technique here. We also have a blog article on it here. So next piece of additional context would be breadcrumbs. You can add a breadcrumb using this method, and you can give it a category, message, and level. Think of this as like a timestamp of something happening leading up to that event, that error when it happens. So some good examples are state changes or user authentication. Let's take a look at some more examples. So in my JavaScript app, as I added items to my shopping cart that we saw earlier in the demo, I wanted to collect a breadcrumb for every time I click that button that adds it to the cart. So this is important because in its absence, you would have to rely on looking at this. And this isn't very friendly or readable because I might not remember what all my hundreds of divs or buttons to refer to if I wrote them months ago. Another good example for breadcrumbs is indicating the start or stop of any lifecycle method for a component in something like Angular, React, Android, or iOS. And you can still use them in backend code for indicating anything at all that's going on, like a module being loaded or services getting connected and so forth, logins, logouts, or anything mission critical. The last piece of context we'll look at is something called the extra or the additional information. So this is great for a piece of object form data that you want included if an error occurs. So in my example here, I set the additional data every time I add something to the shopping cart. And what I actually set is an immutable copy of that object data. So here was the demo. When we click buy, each time we just keep updating that extra with whatever the current state of that cart is. And this is important because what the user sees in the UI could be different than what's in JavaScript in memory or even than what's in the database. In the next section, we'll take a look at Discover and its reporting capabilities. Discover provides visibility into your events across all projects. You're no longer restricted to viewing them per issue. You can now query them by any metadata you'd like. This will help you see patterns and what parts of your apps need the most help, whether that's certain files of source code, controllers, routes, and endpoints, as well as who's impacted, whether it's just users or even what types of devices, browsers, phones, and hosts and servers. So let's take a look at how to build one report from scratch where we look at errors by projects and issues within those projects and then events within that issue, because those are the 3 levels of analysis you could drill into with Discover. After that, we'll take a look at 4 pre-made reports that are the most useful, which any software teams could take advantage of. They query events across a multitude of metadata, not restricted by any particular issue or project. So let's build a new one. So when we build a new Discover query, we always start off with a raw event stream. This is not restricted by any particular project or event attribute. The total events in our table is shown here, and this is for the default time range, which is 24 hours as reflected in this graph here. If you update your time range here, it will update the event graph and this count and the events underneath here. And you still have your facet map, which shows the distribution of values for the tags on all of these events. So let's start by updating our columns here to show just projects and counts. So we want to show projects as our row items and a count for those events. And let's say we want to know how many unique users as well as how many unique issues are comprised from these events. We set that. Here it is. So let's keep debugging. Let's figure out how many issues within one of these particular projects. So you could always select the project name in the top level filtered up here, but you can also set any value from anything in the table here by clicking Add to Filter in this button. So we say Add to Filter. Our one project is now front-end React. So now the items in our table we want are no longer projects themselves, but we want to know the issues. So if we put, say, title of the issue here, and we still just want a count of how many times that happened. So here we are. So now maybe you want to know what were these 138 events that comprise this issue here. So there's two different buttons you can click in this row. If you click this count here, it's going to give you those 138 as an event stream here. So notice that added this attribute up here. So think of this as like the where clause. We selected these columns where this is the project and the title of those events is this. You can always go back. So clicking back will undo any little click you made. To actually save the report, you would have to hit save as, and you'll never mess up someone else's report. You would have to hit update or save as to save it. So another way to see these 138, if you don't want to retain the table view and you want to see maybe the stack trace of some of those, then click view details. And now we're on the event details page. So here you have all your usual information, stack trace, breadcrumbs, tags, and then you can flip through the events here. So this so far has been one issue within one project, but the true power in Discover is to analyze events across multiple projects and issues. So let's see some of those pre-made reports we were talking about. So this is errors per release over time. So you want to make sure that you're setting the release where you initialize your Sentry SDK. You want to put something like the version of your app so that then you can see your releases side by side and how many events you had, how many users were impacted, and so forth. Another useful report is unhandled errors in general. So here's the title of those issues and then the counts for each of those. Another one is URLs by the number of errors happening from that URL. So that's here. And another one is files causing the most events. So let's say we want to know what were some of those events affecting our app.py? Then you could say stack.filename, app.py. And now we want to know what were those actual events. We know the file, so if we say we want the event message, and maybe we want to know, we'll just say the timestamp, and then here they are. Another neat thing you can do is you can actually click on values from the facet map here. So if something caught your eye that a certain browser was always causing these or a certain server name, then you can click on that value and it will add it to your where clause. So if we say this all started from a request from Chrome, then we click that and now it sets that attribute here and it updated our events. So we now have a restricted view of events in our table. So another useful report type that you can do is one based on any custom tag that you've set in your application. So we saw in the demo earlier that we set one called customer type. So we set this when the React app was mounting and the user info was getting loaded in. So now I can see which of my customers are having the most errors. So in this case, it's the large plan customers. So from here, I can click on this count, and this will set the table view so it's looking at only errors for the large plan. And then from here, I can select more information about them. So maybe what was the error message and the count to start us off. Okay, hey team, this is Will again. That was the end of the new content for the video. Now we're going to transition into a Q&A session.
All right, now on to the first Sentry related question. The first one is, how do I sort by affected users on issues, i.e. issues affecting most number of users?
Hey, it's Will here. So yeah, you can sort by how many unique users being affected. If you go to Discover, or maybe rewatch the section on the Discover demo in this webinar, there's like a column attribute that you can put in that table called count unique, and then just select user. And then make sure like your row item is actually like an issue title. So probably put like the title attribute. You wouldn't want your row items to be like projects if you're trying to look at how many unique users were affected by the issue.
Cool. Thank you. Next one is for suspect commits. It was mentioned that it flags commits that touched files in the stack trace. Does this feature work and still pinpoint suspect files if your app is packaged with Webpack, Parcel, etc.?
Yes, it does, because the suspect commits are working off of like the source code coming from like your GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. So packaging, if your concern is like minification, as long as you upload your source maps, it will unminify them. So then it compares that unminified JavaScript to your source code, which was also unminified. Your source code's never minified. So that should be fine.
Cool. Someone asked, what does Sentry replace? In other words, what are people using instead of Sentry that Sentry solves or is better than, and how?
Okay, I'll try to keep this answer short. Some people replace logging solutions with Sentry because with a log, it kind of aggregates a lot of info, does that, sends it all to the server, and then you have to parse through it and find the errors. And it's not as much context. Like if you look at our UI, people really like how we put the stack trace, breadcrumbs, and tags in front of you. Whereas Sentry, fundamentally is collecting the error inside your app and already giving like a context with that stack trace. So that's probably like the biggest key that people sometimes get hung up on in terms of the difference.
Cool. Does the data scrubbing fields include embedded JSON fields?
So if you're curious about the JSON, when you're looking at like a Sentry issue and you click that JSON link and it gives you like the big JSON representation of the Sentry issue coming from our database, yes, it does scrub all of those. And if you're wondering about JSON that maybe was sent as like the extra information, like on the event, it really depends on like where that JSON you're referring to is set. So yeah, if it's the extra piece where you use the method set extra, it does apply on that as well.
Cool. This next one is more of a comment, but I think we can address it. I would love to see an example of whitelist URLs. We get many error reports from Google front-end SDKs and would love to stop manually deleting those events.
Yeah, I'm going to request screen share and I'll just show you a quick example of an issue and how I would go about doing that. Let me select my screen, share. Okay, so here's an error, and let's pretend this one was caused by this, like a Google SDK or something that came in. We're not really sure if it was our app or not. So when we scroll down here, here's the URL that it was like loaded from. So this was the URL, say this is like a third-party ad service or Google or something unknown. This is who served up like the file that caused this error. So you would want to take this URL and then put it in your SDK where you initialize your SDK, where you pass that config option for blacklist URL, for instance. Or if you want to do whitelist and only permit from certain things, then you can do that as well. But if you wanted to blacklist this one out, that's how you do it. So let me give back the screen.
Cool.
Stop share.
All right. Next question. Is release and deployment, is that the same thing?
So they're a little different. So the reason why we came up with deployments is because sometimes people issue releases like every hour, even every commit, and because of the way their CI/CD process works. But not all those releases then are actually getting deployed if they're only deploying like once a day. So deploy is just like a separate tag. I think this question came in before we got to this section in the webinar. Deploy is a way to put like a tag. So if you're looking at like your releases dashboard and you've got like 50 different releases over the past week, well, deploy will actually tell you which one of those got deployed. So you don't, you can just use releases. If in your CI/CD, when you actually push to production, that's when you can set like a release for that, and that can serve as your deploy. But some people still wanted like an additional way to indicate it's a deploy. So
cool. Can I set quotas per environment?
Yeah, let me share screen on this one because this is a good question. So requesting. So yes, you can. You could do it from either, well, it's not like setting a quota, but you could just rate limit completely everything coming from like, say, like a test or a staging environment. If you go to like your DSN key for that app, you could actually create multiple and you could have different DSN keys for each environment. So let's say this first one will go to production and then we have a different release and deploy my app here. And maybe this one's for staging. So then I can come in here and I could just say like rate limit, like everything. Go to Discover, look at your graph, how many events you have, and do the math and figure out that you want to rate limit nearly everything coming from that staging environment, for instance. And the other way you could do it, we have this before send callback. So this is now not the server side, this is in your app. And in here, you can just look at the event and just have some code that says like if event dot environment is test or dev, then return null. So it won't even make its way to the server. Yeah. Give back control.
Cool. Great. I'm attempting to use Sentry with an Electron app. How can I best use tags to delineate errors coming from my main process for renderer process versus browser windows we have created to handle background processes?
Yeah, so with Electron, my question would be, is there a way, like in whatever code's executing, can you do like process.env and that'll like reveal to you which process is currently in execution? Like, is there a way that that JavaScript can be aware of what process it's executing in? In that case, well, when you can get that information, then just do like Sentry and scope.set tag, and you'll indicate that there. And then maybe look at, I don't know if there's anything in like Electron's configuration, like when you initialize the Electron framework itself, if there's any kind of like middleware or config where you can like hook into or use callbacks for like different processes that you're creating, and they'll always have like the tag getting auto assigned. So then you wouldn't have to go into like all your source files and instrument that.
Cool. Next question. Are mini dumps and symbols retained so that I can download it for offline inspection or only used in their pre-processed form? And second question is Dwarf supported natively?
Yes, you can download them. So if you're looking at like a dump that got uploaded on Sentry.io, like your standard, like the event, the issue page, if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see like the .dmp file there or any associated attachments that you uploaded. You might need to go into like I think your project settings first or org settings and enable early adopter features or enable additional features. So that'll appear.
Cool. How does the symbolication work when lacking symbols? If symbols are uploaded after the mini dump, does the stack trace get auto updated? And does that change the fingerprint of the error, possibly changing the link to report?
I might have to reach out to you about that one. And I'm not, normally you upload them ahead of time. I mean, if the events are immutable in Sentry, so if an event comes in and it's saved and then you're uploading debug symbols after, I'm not sure if those will get associated to it. I want to say no, but I'd have to double check. We'll follow up with you after.
Cool. A couple more questions here. How does error grouping work in context of continuous deployment where the source lines get ever so slightly changed? I've seen some compilers fold the optimized functions through stack trace or mucking the symbols with wrong line numbers.
It sounds like that'll probably create new Sentry issues if the stack trace is like slightly different. I would suggest maybe revisit the section in this on SDK fingerprinting. A lot of our like ways you can alter these grouping algorithms by altering the fingerprint were actually designed for C++ and native and things of that nature. So if you go, or just go to our documentation and see that you can like cut out different stack frames from what get used. So if you can identify things that are causing things to group differently, you can essentially like cut those things out from our grouping algorithm.
Cool. How do we stack scope? Does it build up additively like adding breadcrumbs, or do scope calls need to be nested?
Scope in general is managed by the SDK. I know breadcrumbs are just, as soon as the SDK is initialized, breadcrumbs just start getting recorded until like the error is sent. Scope, you can actually, I mean, you can manage it yourself. Typically, like it does what you need it to, but we do have documentation on how to like push and pop onto like the scope stack if you need to. And in scope calls need to be nested. I'd have to understand your question more. We can reach out to you.
Cool. Let's see. Okay. I use Sentry as part of a framework and then integrate it with another app. The main purpose is for Sentry to detect crash on the frameworks, not the main app. The main app is obfuscated. Without the app's DSYM file, is there any possible way to make the stack trace visible? We're currently thinking about excluding the frameworks from obfuscation.
So I'm trying to understand if it's the errors coming from the app or errors coming from the framework. Maybe let's follow up with you after. I'm not as familiar with this kind of like setup and using DSYM symbols in general. Here, let me just reread it. The main purpose, detect a crash in the framework, not the app. Yeah, let's follow up after on this.
Cool. In the node client, the examples are flush, parentheses. What does flush do and is it required?
Flush sounds like a method called by like the SDK internally. I want to say that's for like pushing the error up to Sentry. Like you're collecting a lot of breadcrumbs, tags are being set, the stack trace, the call stack is growing. So eventually if the error happens, then you flush, you sent that up to Sentry and like you reset the scope. That's also a term used with transactions, which is like a new feature we have coming out. So I don't know if you read that off of our documentation on distributed tracing. If you saw that in there, then it basically means like, okay, push up the transaction, like flush it out.
Cool. For web projects backed by a node server that proxies to other microservices, would you recommend having two Sentry projects, one for the web front end and another for the node server, or one combined Sentry project?
That sounds like those are two separate kind of like one's a proxy and then you have some microservices going on. If those are separate code bases, or in general, if you have proxy and microservices, those are definitely separate projects. Otherwise, if you had one project for both, then like your human eye would have to parse through all those errors coming in and kind of decide like, is it from the proxy or is it from the microservice? And also you wouldn't be able to rate limit those separately because they'd be one project. And especially if they're separate code bases, and that's even more reason to really create separate projects for each of those.
Cool. Is it possible to show the event ID on the Sentry error page? For example, it looks like we are having issues shown to the user. Somewhat like Ray ID used by Cloudflare, non-technical users repeatedly send me screenshots with the error page, but it doesn't help. So having the event ID there to just search that and find the specific event faced by the user would help a lot.
Yeah, let me request screen. I like this question. Yeah, typically by default, we're not going to show such like technical informations to users, but let me show you how you could accomplish this. So in the demo, you might have seen there was like a user feedback modal that popped up. So here's actually the documentation on it. It looks like this, and notice there's no event ID on here. This is like a jQuery modals, and you'd have to be comfortable using like the CSS and HTML here, but you can actually trigger your own modal. And in that modal, I suppose you could pass in the event ID. So the way this user feedback dialog works is this before send is executed after the error is thrown, but right before it's sent by the SDK to Sentry.io. So what I would do is maybe look at the event ID on this object here, because the SDK creates the event ID, and then pass it into your like report dialog. Like if you want to, you would have to give them like a visual, I'd say, some little pop-up or a tooltip or something. So if you have Angular, then write some kind of like Angular component to pop up here, or view, or whatever you're using. Because this one here is our jQuery one. Next.
Cool. Let me take this back from you. All right. There's some overlap between Sentry and monitoring solutions like Datadog. How do you see the delineation and integration?
Yeah, good question. So Datadog, they tend to be more of like systems monitoring. We just published a blog post about what we call the 4 types of monitoring. There's like systems, and that might cover a lot more of like CPU, RAM consumption, and that's things more about like your machines and your hardware. Whereas Sentry, it lives inside your code. It's an SDK there. So it's not really as aware of that CPU and RAM. There's no way it could tell you like the health of those things. It's really concerned with the health of your app and giving you the best experience for understanding that. That's systems monitoring. Then we have logging, which is just kind of like collecting everything. It's also called like the vomit all approach. And then it's just asking you to parse through that. And with logging solutions, you might be getting charged for all those logs, and maybe like there's nothing even going wrong. Whereas Sentry is very error driven. Like nothing is getting sent up to our server unless there's an error that's happening.
Cool. About out of time, but I do have one more question. For SVN code bases, can we still use release and deploy features?
Let me see real quick. SVN code base. I'm assuming this is like a version manager. And the question again, can we use release and deploy features? If there's no like if SVN's a source versioning tool and we don't have an integration, you can actually like push those commits to Sentry. Like we have an API for that. If you go to our documentation, you can actually like send like the commit hashes and so forth to us. So then you should still be able to use those.
And I'm going to squeeze one last one in
Sure.
here from Kelly in the chat. What are the best practices when you have a microservice like architecture? For example, can we merge separate projects events into a single event on the Sentry backend? Otherwise, you may see the same issue across multiple services.
No, there's no way to like merge events between separate Sentry projects. It would have to come down to kind of like setting filters in each project appropriately, or just like handling them case by case.